When the world scattered from Babel's ruins, cursed with confusion and stripped of a common tongue, humanity fractured into wandering tribes. Each clan stumbled through the wilderness, unable to communicate, unable to unite. It was divine punishment, yes, but it was also a rebirth. The sons of Ham, the Canaanites, carried a legacy stained by disobedience, yet they possessed something dangerous: ambition. They trudged through merciless deserts, crossed nameless mountains, and endured scorching valleys. Their journey was long, brutal, and relentless, until finally, exhausted and desperate, they discovered it. The Jordan Valley. Before them stretched a vision of paradise. Lush green fields rolled like ocean waves. Fruit trees bent heavy with abundance. A mighty river carved through the landscape like the very breath of the earth. Golden wheat danced in the breeze. And standing there, gazing upon this promised land, they made a declaration that would echo through eternity. Here we will build our kingdom. Here we will raise Sodom. The construction was merciless. Every foundation stone was laid with blood. Every wall rose through conquest and sweat. The Canaanites worked like men possessed by a vision of greatness. They carved through solid rock with bronze implements, designing streets that intersected with mathematical precision. They erected massive walls, thick and towering, as if daring the world itself to challenge them. But they didn't stop there. They became masters of water. Intricate canals redirected the Jordan's flow directly into their fields, their gardens, their very doorsteps. The land responded as if enchanted. Figs swelled on branches, dates hung in clusters, barley and grapes flourished beyond imagination. Flax grew tall and strong. Word spread like wildfire. Merchants from Egypt arrived with caravans laden with exotic goods. Arabian traders journeyed across deadly deserts just to glimpse this miracle city. Travelers from distant Anatolia told stories of the jewel rising from the plain. Sodom's architecture was breathtaking. White stone buildings stretched toward the heavens, their wide doorways welcoming endless streams of visitors. Purple tapestries hung from every terrace, rippling in the wind like royal banners. The air itself was intoxicating. Incense mixed with fresh bread, spiced wine mingled with perfumed oils. Fountains depicted mythological scenes carved by master artisans. Hanging gardens defied gravity, fed by invisible water systems. Public squares became stages where musicians performed on lutes, drums, and flutes. When darkness fell, 10,000 torches illuminated streets filled with dancing, laughter, music, and excess. The wealth was staggering. Trade became Sodom's lifeblood. Caravans arrived daily bearing gold from distant mines, ivory from unknown lands, precious gems that caught the light like captured stars, perfumed oils, exotic spices, rare wines, and yes, even slaves. Sodom's blacksmiths forged weapons of legendary quality. Sculptors created idols so lifelike they seemed ready to speak. Tailors worked with silk, linen, and furs, crafting garments that kings envied. Excellence became the city's trademark. When the time came for leadership, the people chose carefully. They selected the most cunning among them, the most charismatic, the most ruthlessly ambitious. They crowned Bara as Sodom's first king. Bara was young, beautiful, with a face that inspired trust and a tongue that could make wickedness sound like wisdom. He possessed a terrifying gift, the ability to transform corruption into virtue, to make crooked paths appear straight. He ruled with charm and smiles, but beneath that polished exterior lurked a darkness deeper than any abyss. Under Bara's reign, Sodom reached its zenith of glory, and simultaneously descended into depths of depravity that would shock future generations. Meanwhile, south of Sodom, another city was rising. Gomorrah. If Sodom was a jewel carved by ambition and strength, Gomorrah was a poisonous flower of irresistible beauty. Its founders were different: sculptors, musicians, poets, architects, artists who worshipped beauty above all else. They chose gentle hills, where sunset painted the sky in liquid gold. There they constructed temples of delicate design. Streets of polished stone wound between houses that resembled palaces. Hanging gardens cascaded from every building. Purple and blue curtains danced in the breeze. Fountains sang as water fell in musical patterns. Gomorrah didn't compete with Sodom in raw power. It competed in elegance. Art flourished there like nowhere else. Songs told epic legends. Theaters performed dramas exploring gods and human passion. The people surrendered completely to sensory pleasure. Every festival became a celebration of the flesh, of pleasure without boundaries, of freedom without conscience. The sacred merged with the sensual until they became indistinguishable. Fertility rituals transformed into public spectacles where wine-drunk participants abandoned themselves to desire without shame, without morality, without any sense of divine law. Gomorrah's first king was Birsa, sharp-featured with a voice like honey and eyes that captivated everyone they touched. He mastered the art of pleasing crowds. Under his leadership, lust became institutionalized. Pleasure became law. Birsa cultivated absolute freedom. Every desire was valid, every impulse was sacred, every boundary was meant to be crossed, and so Sodom and Gomorrah became twin cities of corruption, two jewels of power and perversion on the Jordan plain. Each fed the other's wickedness, each encouraged the other's rebellion. Together they formed something hell itself would envy. Among their many abominations, one stood out with particular prominence: homosexuality. It began with abundance. When people no longer struggle for survival, they begin struggling against limits. The men of Sodom, wealthy, lazy, drunk on their own importance, began perverting natural desires. They stopped pursuing women and began lusting after their own gender. At first, the practice remained hidden. Then it spread among the powerful. Soon, it burst into the open, in streets, in public squares, on the very doorsteps of people's homes. This wasn't merely a secret vice or isolated deviance. It became culture. It became normal. It became institutionalized pride. What other nations still considered shameful, Sodom and Gomorrah proclaimed as freedom. They wore it as a crown of identity. They boasted about uncontrolled appetites as if they were virtues. At royal banquets, guests indulged openly with young men brought specifically for that purpose. There was no need for discretion, no need for silence. In Sodom, the wicked were celebrated, and God's voice was drowned out by human applause. Temples dedicated to false deities became centers where fertility was worshipped not through sacred marriage but through acts that violated everything holy. Men with men, priests with acolytes, old men with youths, all disguised as spiritual connection, all protected under the banner of false gods. Pleasure was their deity. Perversion was their liturgy. Children grew up witnessing impurity as normal. They were taught that limits didn't exist, that desire was the only law that mattered. They saw images, heard stories, received instruction to reject any teaching from a God who dared set boundaries. The judges didn't punish immorality. Instead, they punished the righteous who dared speak against it. Strangers who passed through the city gates weren't treated as guests but as prey for their lust. No one entered Sodom without being tempted, touched, tested. The most sacred act, the union between man and woman ordained by God since Eden, was trampled, ridiculed, replaced by unnatural relationships driven by dominance, pleasure, and ego. There was no love, no fidelity, only impulse, only desire, only flesh seeking flesh. And yet, despite all this, it was precisely that prosperity that attracted Lot. While living alongside his uncle Abraham, Lot also prospered tremendously. His flocks multiplied, his tents spread across the landscape. His possessions grew so vast that conflict became inevitable. Abraham's shepherds clashed with Lot's shepherds. They argued, they accused. The land simply couldn't support so much blessing. What had once been harmony now cracked under the weight of abundance. Abraham, the man of the altar, the friend of God, rose with fatherly dignity. He approached his nephew Lot, the young man he'd raised since his father's death. He looked at him with both tenderness and firmness. "Let there be no conflict between us. If you go left, I'll go right. You choose first." And Lot lifted his eyes. What he saw in that moment changed his destiny forever. Before him stretched the Jordan Plain, an earthly Eden. Green fields stretched endlessly. Crystal-clear waters sparkled in sunlight. Sweet air filled his lungs. And there, shimmering like temptation wrapped in gold, stood the cities of the plain, especially Sodom. From a distance, Sodom was spectacular. Its towers pierced the clouds. Its markets rang with the music of silver and gold. Its squares overflowed with people, fragrances, music, laughter. It was vibrant, seductive, powerful. And Lot fell in love. He didn't pray, he didn't seek counsel. He simply looked, desired, and chose. It was the beginning of his end. With confident strides, Lot separated from Abraham and descended toward the plain. Initially, he pitched his tent near Sodom, just nearby, just on the edges. But like a shadow lengthening at dusk, Sodom's influence crept over him. Soon, his business was inside the city, then his home, then his heart. Lot lived in Sodom, surrounded by perversion, debauchery, and sin. And he didn't leave. Though his righteous soul was tormented by what he witnessed, luxury spoke louder. Comfort lulled his conscience to sleep. Silence became his chain. He had pursued prosperity without considering consequences. Blinded by abundance, he chose his path without thinking about his family. There, in that corrupt city, Lot raised his daughters. Pure young women born under their father's faith but exposed daily to Sodom's darkness. They saw perversion with their own eyes. They heard screams tearing through the night. They witnessed impure rituals performed in broad daylight. They walked streets filled with men lost in homosexuality, where sin wasn't hidden but celebrated with pride. They grew up in a place without altars where God's name was mocked, where impurity had become custom and the sacred was a forgotten memory. Despite this environment, Lot's daughters were betrothed to two men from Sodom. But these men didn't fear God. They were products of Sodom, born in its streets, shaped by its culture. They might not have participated in the worst excesses, but they were not righteous, holy, or obedient to Abraham's God. And so life continued. Every day, Sodom and Gomorrah sank deeper into open, blatant rebellion against heaven. But God would not ignore this. The Almighty who had been patient, who had waited, who had watched in silence, he had heard. A cry rose from the earth like bitter smoke, the cry of the oppressed, of the righteous scorned, of innocence violated. It reached the throne of heaven, and judgment was decreed. But before fire descended, God decided to visit his friend Abraham. In the heat of midday, as the patriarch rested at his tent entrance, the Lord appeared accompanied by two heavenly beings. Abraham saw them, ran forward, and honored them, unaware he was about to hear a sentence that would shake his soul. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," the Lord declared. "Their sin is grievous. I will go down and see if their wickedness matches the cry that has reached me." Abraham shuddered. He thought of his nephew Lot, of Lot's family, of the possibility, however remote, that righteous people might still exist amid such darkness. With tears in his soul and trembling voice, he interceded. "Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? Lord, if there were 50 righteous, would you destroy them?" And God replied, "If I find 50 righteous in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake." Abraham persisted. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? With each plea, the answer remained the same. "If there are righteous people, I will forgive. Yet throughout the entire expanse of Sodom and Gomorrah, not even that tiny glimmer of light could be found. Evil had contaminated everything. Even the men engaged to Lot's daughters would mock the message of salvation. And then the two angels departed for Sodom. They descended from heaven in human form, bearers of divine judgment. The city still sang, still laughed, still reveled in sin, completely unaware that its final night had begun. When they arrived, Lot was sitting at the city gate. He wasn't there by accident. He held a position as judge, fulfilling duty among a wicked generation. When he saw them, something inside him trembled. He stood immediately, bowed low, and begged them to enter his house. They accepted. They crossed his threshold. The door closed behind them, and night fell over Sodom like a thick, suffocating blanket. But hell was about to break loose. It didn't take long. News spread like wildfire through the streets. Strangers have arrived. New men, different men, and the rumors awakened the city's dormant lust. From every corner, from every house, from every immoral street, they gathered, young and old alike. All the men of Sodom converged on Lot's dwelling like a ravenous pack. They pounded on the door. They shouted. They demanded, "Where are the men who came to your house tonight? Bring them out. We want to have sex with them." Perversion was no longer hidden. Now it demanded. It wanted to penetrate every corner, even the dwelling of the righteous. Lot stepped outside in desperation. He closed the door behind him and faced the mob, his heart hammering violently. "I beg you, my brothers, do not commit this wicked act." And then, in a desperate moment, perhaps influenced by the culture surrounding him, Lot offered his own daughters. "I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. I will bring them to you. Do to them as you wish, but do nothing to these men, for they have come under my protection." But the men of Sodom didn't want the daughters. They didn't seek women. They wanted the men. Their lust was specific, twisted, violent. "Get out of our way," they roared. "This foreigner comes here to judge us. We will harm you more than them." And they surged toward Lot. But then heaven's hand intervened. The angels opened the door, seized Lot, and pulled him inside. And with a single word, with a single gesture, the eyes of every man in that crowd were struck with blindness. Darkness swallowed them. They stumbled over each other. They groped frantically for the door. They cursed. They screamed. But they could no longer see, because judgment had begun, and the clock of mercy was ticking. The angels turned to Lot urgently. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law? Sons? Daughters? Get them out, because we are going to destroy this city. The outcry against it has reached heaven, and the Lord has sent us to obliterate it." Lot trembled. He ran to his sons-in-law, the men betrothed to his daughters, and begged them, "Get out of this place. God is going to destroy the city." But they laughed. They thought he was joking. They didn't believe him. And they stayed to die. As dawn began breaking, the angels urged Lot with increasing urgency. "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters and go, so you won't perish in the city's punishment." Get up? But he hesitated. He still loved that place. He still looked back longingly. And then the angels took him by the hand. Him, his wife, his 2 daughters, and physically dragged them outside. Because God's mercy still burned for Lot. When they were finally beyond the gates, one angel spoke with commanding power. "Escape for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains or you will perish." Lot ran with his family. The sun was rising on the horizon. Meanwhile, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah continued their wickedness. The streets bustled at dawn, not with worship, but with sin. The noise wasn't prayer, but mocking laughter, polluted markets, profane altars, bodies offered as worship to flesh. Drums continued beating in pagan temples. Priests danced amid incense and perversion, and no one imagined that heaven was no longer silent. The trial was underway. and they didn't know it. And it was in that moment, in the midst of their arrogance, that the heavens opened. It wasn't an ordinary storm. It wasn't rain. It was the roar of judgment, the thunder of eternal wrath. A gigantic crack formed in the sky as if heaven itself had been torn open by an invisible sword. From that opening, flames emerged, alive, conscious, hungry. Rain of fire and burning sulfur began descending with uncontrollable fury. Sodom trembled. Gomorrah screamed. Houses ignited on contact. Entire towers collapsed. The earth itself split open, devouring inhabitants whole. It was as if hell had been unleashed upon the earth. The stones burned. The air turned to fire. Rivers boiled. Trees exploded. The inhabitants fled in absolute panic, enveloped in choking smoke, drenched in sweat, covered in ash. Mothers dragged screaming children barefoot through burning streets. Arrogant men who once boasted of power ran like terrified animals, their eyes filled with horror. The city's perfume was replaced by the stench of burning flesh and vaporized blood. Some called out to their gods. Others fell to their knees, looking skyward. But the response was more fire. Roofs collapsed. Sculptures melted like wax. From the distance came the howls of beasts fleeing into the desert. While the hearts of cities crumbled under heaven's fury, Lot fled with his face covered, leading his wife and daughters. Behind them, hell consumed everything. But she, Lot's wife, couldn't resist. Curiosity proved stronger than fear. She turned her head, just for a second, just an instant, and she stood petrified. Her flesh vanished. Her soul froze. A pillar of salt, white and tragic, rose where a wife, a mother, a woman had once stood. As the family continued escaping, in the distance the last gasp of the cursed cities could be witnessed. The ground still steamed. Stones glowed red-hot. Crows circled above what had once been human empires, and the wind carried with it the scent of God's justice. Sodom had been swallowed by heaven. Gomorrah was erased from the map. Lot ran, not by strength, not by choice. He ran because God was dragging him from the hell he'd called home for years. His body was safe, but his soul still trembled. His daughters followed, covered in ash, without a mother, without land, without hope. They were the last of their line, the last survivors of the apocalypse. They reached Zoar, a tiny, insignificant city ignored by the flames but not by fear. There it didn't rain fire, but it rained nightmares. Lot couldn't sleep. He saw burning faces in his dreams. He heard screams every time he closed his eyes. He felt the weight of his wife turn to salt with a single glance. There was no peace in Zoar, only a constant whisper, "It's not over yet." And so fear drove them out again. Like shadows, they crept into the mountains. There, in the solitude of a cave, they hid. Darkness embraced them. Cold penetrated their bones, and silence spoke volumes. In that abyss of solitude, without men, without people, without hope, Lot's daughters began speaking among themselves. They had grown up in Sodom amid orgies, idolatry, and perversion. Though they escaped judgment, judgment didn't escape them. And there, among the stones, an idea sprouted. An idea that could only be born from hearts deformed by sin. There is no man on earth who can come to us. Let us make our father drunk and lie with him to preserve offspring. And so they did. The first night they prepared wine, served it generously and poured freely. Lot drank until he lost consciousness, and when silence reigned, the eldest daughter entered the cave, lay with her father, and he knew nothing. Not when she lay down, not when she rose. Sin was sown. The next night they repeated the act. The younger followed her sister's path. Lot, drunk again, lay with his second daughter. And again, he knew nothing. In those dark nights, deep in that cave, the sin that God had buried under fire rose again in the wombs of those young women. and from those wombs were born Moab and Ben-Ammi, 2 names that would become a curse for generations, 2 peoples who would build pagan altars, who would burn their children in sacrifice, who would wage war against Israel, who would blaspheme the name of the living God. Sodom's sin didn't die in the fire. It hid in a cave. It multiplied, and it became nations. And so the world learned a forgotten lesson. It's not enough to flee judgment. You must be transformed. Because if not, the curse that destroyed a city will settle in your lineage.